Necromancer's quest for revenge against Lich Hunter. Smoke still writhed from the blackened stones like dying serpents, carrying the acrid stench of burned flesh and melted silver. Zephyr Ashfall picked through the ruins with reverent fingers, each charred fragment of his master's tower a monument to power that had been and would never be again. The phylactery lay in 7 pieces. Crimson crystal scattered across scorched marble, each shard pulsing with the faintest echo of Archmage Valdris's imprisoned soul. Zephyr knelt among the debris, gathering the fragments with hands that trembled despite his best efforts. 3 years of apprenticeship, and this was what remained of the most brilliant necromancer to ever walk the mortal plane. "Such devotion," Whisper croaked from the shadows. The raven's voice carried the weight of centuries, each word dripping with knowledge that predated kingdoms. "Even in death, you serve him faithfully." Zephyr's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Death has a way of clarifying one's priorities. He lifted a fragment to the dying light, watching crimson veins pulse within the crystal's heart. Through the phylactery, he could almost hear Valdris's voice, that familiar blend of patience and exasperation that had shaped Zephyr's understanding of the necromantic arts. The old Lich had been working on something revolutionary before Mordain struck. Something about achieving undeath without sacrificing one's humanity. Now that knowledge burned with the rest. Mordain knew exactly when to strike, Whisper observed, preening black feathers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. While you were gathering components in the Shadowlands, while Valdris was deep in his research, vulnerable. Mordain the Collector. Zephyr spat the name like a curse. What did he collect this time? My master's research, his life, or just another trophy for his wall of conquered rivals? The shadow raven's eyes glittered with malice. All 3, I suspect. Your master discovered something that threatened Mordain's monopoly on advanced necromancy. The ability to become a Lich while retaining one's compassion, one's connection to the living world. Imagine the implications. Zephyr could imagine. He'd watched Valdris struggle with the traditional path to Lichdom, seen the old necromancer's horror at the thought of murdering innocents to fuel his transformation. Valdris had sought another way, and apparently found it. The sound of marching bones interrupted his contemplation. Skeletal warriors emerged from the settling dust, their empty sockets burning with pale flame. Behind them strode creatures that had once been human, flesh hanging in ribbons from animated corpses that still remembered how to wield weapons. Mordain's cleanup crew. Loot first, murder second. Zephyr stood slowly, phylactery fragments clutched in his left hand, while his right began weaving patterns that would have made most priests weep. How thoroughly professional. The first wave hit him like a tide of chattering bone and rotting meat. Zephyr's grief transformed into something darker, hungrier. Necrotic energy erupted from his fingertips in wild, undisciplined torrents that carved through undead flesh like a scythe through wheat. A skeleton warrior lunged with rusted blade raised high. Zephyr gestured sharply, and the ground beneath its feet erupted in a forest of bone spears, femurs and ribcage torn from the tower's foundation, animated by pure rage. The warrior impaled itself on 3 spears simultaneously, its deathlight flickering out with a sound like breaking glass. But rage made him sloppy. A ghoul slipped past his defenses, claws raking across his ribs and leaving furrows that burned with unholy fire. Zephyr snarled and grabbed the creature's face, channeling raw death magic through his palm. Flesh peeled away from bone in wet, spiraling ribbons until nothing remained but a skull that crumbled to ash. More came, always more. Zephyr fought with the desperate fury of the bereft, each spell fueled by memories of his master's patient instruction. Valdris teaching him to commune with spirits without losing himself to their whispers. Valdris showing him how to preserve knowledge in crystallized soul fragments. Valdris defending his research against those who called it heretical, blasphemous, impossible. The combat was a dance of death and memory, each gesture pulling him deeper into the darkness that had claimed his master's killers. By the time the last ghoul fell, Zephyr stood among the ruins like a monument to vengeful grief blood-soaked, breathing hard, and more dangerous than he'd ever been. "Impressive," Whisper commented dryly, "though you fight like a man possessed, which, given your chosen profession, is either redundant or disturbing." Zephyr wiped ghoul blood from his face, leaving streaks of crimson across pale skin. They came to desecrate my master's grave. What did they expect? Flowers and forgiveness? They expected easy pickings from a grieving apprentice. The raven hopped closer, studying the scattered fragments with ancient eyes. What they found was a necromancer discovering just how much power lives in properly motivated hatred. The truth of it settled over Zephyr like a shroud. He'd always been talented, but this was something else entirely. Grief had unlocked potential he'd never suspected, turned his scholarly magic into something primal and terrible. The fragments, he said, studying the crystalline shards that still pulsed with faint light. If I collect them all, you might be able to resurrect him, Whisper finished. Though the process would require finding all 7 pieces, and Mordain has surely scattered them across the realm by now. He's too clever to leave such power within easy reach. Zephyr pocketed the fragments he'd recovered, their warmth pressing against his chest like a promise, or a threat. Then I'll find them, every last one. Even if it takes years. Even if it means becoming the very thing your master feared to become. Especially then. Whisper cackled, a sound like breaking bones and bitter wisdom. Ah, apprentice, your master always said you had potential. He simply never specified what kind. As Zephyr turned his back on the ruins, the first fragment pulsed against his ribs with steady, patient rhythm. Like a heartbeat, like a countdown. Behind them, smoke continued to rise from the tower's remains, carrying the dreams of a gentle Lich and the birth cries of something far more dangerous. Nethermore sprawled across the graves of kings like a fungal infection given architecture and ambition. Streets paved with tombstones wound between buildings constructed from mortared femurs, while vendors hawked everything from blessed bones to cursed skulls beneath awnings of stretched skin. The city's motto, carved in 6 languages above the main gate, read simply, "Death is our business." Zephyr found it refreshingly honest. Lady Morticia holds court in the ossuary, Whisper explained as they navigated streets where skeletal horses pulled carriages full of living passengers. She's controlled the bone trade for 3 centuries. Vampire nobility, old blood, older gold. The ossuary rose from Nethermore's heart like a cathedral built by madmen with excellent taste in architecture. Ribcages formed flying buttresses, while skull-paved courtyards led to doors carved from single mammoth bones. Guards in polished mail stood at attention, some living, some not, all professional in their dedication to controlled violence. Lady Morticia Graveheart received visitors in a throne room where the walls breathed. Literally breathed, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of some massive, hidden heart. She herself was a study in preserved beauty, pale skin, unmarked by time, dark hair that moved with its own wind, eyes that held centuries of accumulated amusement. "Zephyr Ashfall," she purred, voice carrying the subtle accent of empires that had crumbled before his great-grandfather's birth. "The grieving apprentice seeks audience with the Bone Queen. How traditional. You have something that belongs to my master." Zephyr placed his hand over the phylactery fragments, their pulse quickening in response to proximity to another piece. "I'm prepared to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Lady Morticia's laugh was silver bells and breaking hearts. "Oh, dear boy, you misunderstand your position entirely. I don't negotiate with desperate children. I employ them." The second fragment rested in a place of honor atop her collection, thousands of magical artifacts arranged with the eye of a connoisseur who'd had centuries to develop perfect taste. The crystal pulsed in harmony with the pieces Zephyr carried, creating a resonance that made his bones ache. "The fighting pits," she continued, gesturing toward windows that overlooked an arena carved directly into the cemetery's bedrock. "My champion, Grimjaw, grows bored with easy victories. Defeat him, and the fragment is yours. Fail, and you join my collection in a more permanent capacity." The arena floor was sand mixed with bone meal, perfect for absorbing blood while providing decent footing for combatants who might not have traditional circulatory systems. Spectators filled tiers of seats carved from massive tombstones, their cheers echoing off walls decorated with the weapons of fallen gladiators. Grimjaw entered through gates that groaned under the weight of their own malevolence. The champion was a masterwork of necromantic engineering. a skeletal frame wrapped in the souls of a dozen dead warriors, each spirit contributing its own expertise to the collective whole. He moved with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, the brutal efficiency of a veteran soldier, and the cold calculation of an assassin. 12 souls, Whisper observed from the spectator stands. Each one a master of their craft. Your opponent isn't just a fighter, he's an entire military unit compressed into a single frame. Zephyr stepped onto the blood-soaked sand and drew power from the death that saturated every grain. This was his element, his domain. Here, surrounded by centuries of accumulated mortality, he was more than human. The first exchange was pure violence. Grimjaw's blade carved through the air where Zephyr's head had been a heartbeat earlier, while bone spears erupted from the arena floor in response to the Necromancer's desperate gestures. The champion flowed around the attacks like water, his dozen souls providing perfect combat instincts from every angle. But Zephyr had advantages beyond raw skill. He grabbed handfuls of the bone meal sand and spoke words that made reality flinch. The ground beneath Grimjaw's feet became quicksand made from liquefied remains, dragging the champion down, while spectral warriors pulled from the arena's accumulated death rows to pin his arms. Grimjaw's response was brutally elegant. The souls within his frame synchronized, and suddenly he was fighting like 12 warriors occupying the same space. Phantom blades carved through Zephyr's ghostly reinforcements, while the champion's physical form twisted free of the bone quicksand with inhuman flexibility. Impressive technique, Lady Morticia called from her private box. But you're thinking like a scholar, not a gladiator. Down here, elegance is just a quick way to die slowly. The words stung because they were true. Zephyr's magic was precise, scholarly, designed for research and careful experimentation. Grimjaw fought with the accumulated brutality of a dozen lifetimes spent in violence. Time to change the rules. Zephyr stopped trying to fight fair and started fighting angry. The phylactery fragments burned against his chest as he channeled grief into raw necromantic power, pulling not just from the arena's accumulated death, but from every grave in Nethermoor's sprawling cemetery. Skeletons began clawing their way up through the sand, not elegant warriors, just angry corpses with nothing left to lose. Grimjaw cut through the first wave like a scythe through wheat, but there were always more. Hundreds more. The arena floor became a churning sea of bone and rage as Zephyr's summoning reached deeper, pulling up the ancient dead who'd been buried when Nethermoor was just a crossroads beside a modest graveyard. The champion's 12 souls began to fragment under the assault. Too many opponents, too many angles of attack. His perfect coordination dissolved into desperate improvisation as skeletal hands grabbed at his joints and spectral blades sought gaps in his defense. Enough. Lady Morticia's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. The risen dead collapsed into component bones, their animating force severed by a word. Grimjaw stood amid the wreckage, still functional but clearly damaged. An interesting solution, the vampire noble continued. Crude, but effective. Very well, you've earned your prize through superior application of overwhelming force. A valid combat philosophy, if lacking in artistry. But even as Lady Morticia spoke, the arena's walls exploded inward. 3 figures in midnight black robes emerged from the smoking gaps, their faces hidden behind masks of polished bone. Mordain's assassins, arriving with the timing of professionals who'd been watching and waiting for their moment. The first assassin moved like liquid shadow, twin daggers seeking Zephyr's heart with surgical precision. The second began weaving a spell that turned the air to acid, while the third simply pointed at Grimjaw and spoke a word that shattered the champion's animating matrix into component souls. Chaos, beautiful, deadly chaos. Zephyr rolled aside as acid air hissed past his face, leaving pitted scars in the arena's stone walls. His counterstrike was pure instinct, a blast of necrotic energy that caught the first assassin's centermass and peeled away flesh in spiraling ribbons. The man's scream was cut short as his lungs liquefied. But the other 2 were already adapting, their magic shifting to counter his necromancy with techniques he'd never seen. They fought like Valdris, with the precision and knowledge that came from studying under a master of the art. More of Mordain's students, more inheritors of stolen knowledge. "Senna, get down," Zephyr shouted to a young necromancer in the stands, a girl who reminded him painfully of his younger self, all eager ambition and dangerous innocence. She'd been watching the gladiatorial match with the intensity of someone trying to learn from every spell and gesture. The second assassin's magic found her anyway. Bone needles erupted from her seat, seeking soft flesh with malicious intent. Senna screamed, throwing up desperate shields that shattered like glass under the assault. Zephyr's rage went beyond fury into something colder and more dangerous. He reached through the phylactery fragments to touch the echo of Valdris's knowledge, pulling techniques from his master's preserved memories. The assassin's bone needles suddenly reversed course, turning on their creator with geometric precision. The man had just enough time to look surprised before his own spell perforated him in 17 places. The third assassin was already retreating, his mission apparently accomplished. Not to kill Zephyr, though that would have been a pleasant bonus, but to send a message. "I'm always watching, always one step ahead, always ready to take everything you care about." Lady Morticia descended from her box with vampiric grace, her expression mixing annoyance with grudging respect. "Well, that was significantly more entertainment than I'd bargained for." She tossed him the phylactery fragment, its crimson surface warm to the touch. "Consider our bargain fulfilled, young necromancer, though I suspect you'll find collecting the remaining pieces far more challenging." Zephyr helped Senna to her feet, noting how she flinched at his touch. He was covered in blood and bone dust, his eyes still burning with the cold fire that had driven off Mordain's assassins. He looked like what he was becoming, something far more dangerous than the scholarly apprentice who'd entered the arena. "Thank you," Senna whispered, her voice shaking but steady. I've been studying your techniques. You fight like the old stories describe Valdris himself." The comparison was a knife between his ribs. Valdris never fought like that. He was better than that. Kinder. Maybe kindness isn't enough anymore. As they left Nethermore behind, the second fragment joined its mate against Zephyr's chest. 2 pieces of 7, pulsing in harmony like twin hearts beating in rhythm. The city's motto followed them through the gates. "Death is our business." 5 more to go, Whisper observed with dark amusement. "And Mordain knows exactly where you're heading next. He's had 3 years to prepare for this moment, apprentice. 3 years to set traps and gather allies and perfect his countermeasures." Zephyr didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Senna's words, about the look in her eyes when she'd thanked him. Hero worship mixed with fear, the expression of someone who'd glimpsed what he was becoming and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. Smart girl, he wasn't sure either. The Whispering Wastes earned their name through simple truth in advertising. Every grain of sand held the crystallized scream of someone who died badly, creating a symphony of suffering that played on frequencies just below human hearing. Most travelers went mad within hours. Necromancers found the experience merely educational. Zephyr had been walking through the sonic hell for 2 days when he realized he was being herded. "The path curves always east," he observed to Whisper, who rode his shoulder like a feathered conscience. "Every canyon, every dune, every supposedly random rock formation, we're being guided toward something." "Or someone," the raven agreed. "The question is whether our mysterious guide intends to help or simply prefers their prey tenderized by despair." The crystallized screams grew louder as they approached the Waste's heart, their harmonics creating interference patterns that made the air itself visible. Geometric shapes of pure sound hung in the sky like impossible architecture, while the ground beneath their feet sang lullabies composed of final words. That's where they found the first screaming stone. It rose from the sand like a monument to concentrated agony, a pillar of crystallized souls 20 feet tall and pulsing with trapped light. Inside, barely visible through the crystal's crimson depths, human shapes writhed in eternal torment. Mordain's work, Whisper identified with professional disgust. He's been experimenting with soul crystallization, turning his victims into weapons. Zephyr approached the stone with careful reverence, placing his palm against its surface. The souls within reacted to his necromantic aura, their struggles intensifying as they sensed potential release. Through the crystal, he could feel their memories, scholars, apprentices, anyone who'd known Valdris or his research. Systematic elimination, he realized with growing horror. Mordain's been hunting down everyone connected to my master, not just rivals or threats, but students, colleagues, anyone who might carry forward his work. Which makes you either the last loose thread, Whisper began, or the perfect bait, finished a new voice from behind them. Cale Doomright stood outlined against the crystalline landscape like divine judgment, given human form. His armor blazed with holy symbols that made the screaming stones recoil, while the sword at his side hummed with enough righteous fury to make the air itself taste of lightning and absolute certainty. Zephyr Ashfall, the paladin continued, his voice carrying the weight of divine mandate. Apprentice to the Lich Valdris, practitioner of forbidden arts, collector of soul fragments for purposes unknown but certainly blasphemous. He drew his blade with the sound of singing steel. I am here to end your corruption before it spreads further. End my corruption? Zephyr laughed, the sound bitter enough to make nearby screams falter in harmony. Paladin, you have no idea what corruption even looks like. Let me educate you. He gestured toward the screaming stones scattered across the wasteland, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one a crystallized monument to Mordain's systematic brutality. Those aren't my victims, holy warrior. They're my master's students. Scholars who sought knowledge. Apprentices who wanted to heal rather than harm. All murdered by the same monster who destroyed Valdris himself. Cale's grip tightened on his sword, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Lies, all necromancers lie, it's your nature. Is it? Zephyr approached the nearest screaming stone and placed both hands against its surface. Then, let's hear the truth from the victims themselves. Power flowed from the phylactery fragments through his body and into the crystallized souls. The stone cracked, hairline fractures spreading across its surface as the trapped spirit stirred toward freedom. One crack became a dozen, then 100, until finally the crystal shattered in a cascade of light and anguished release. The spirits that emerged were not the twisted wraiths Cale expected, but something far more disturbing, ordinary people, still recognizable as the scholars and students they'd been in life. They spoke in overlapping voices, their words creating a chorus of testimony that made the paladin's certainty crumble. Valdris sought to preserve life, not destroy it. Mordain offered partnership, then murder. The research, it could have changed everything, made death itself optional. He crystallized us for our knowledge, not our sins. Cale's sword wavered as the testimonies continued, each spirit adding another layer to a picture that contradicted everything he'd been told about the situation. These weren't the corrupted souls of evil necromancers. They were victims of someone who'd perverted the art for personal gain. Impossible, he whispered, but the word carried no conviction. The church's intelligence was fed to them by Mordain himself, Zephyr finished. Who better to identify dangerous necromancers than the most successful Lich hunter in the realm? He's been playing all sides, paladin, using your church to eliminate his competition while he consolidates power. The sound of slow applause echoed across the crystalline wasteland, accompanied by the rhythmic clanking of animated bone. Mordain, the collector, emerged from behind a particularly large screaming stone, flanked by an honor guard of skeletal champions whose empty sockets burned with stolen souls. Bravo, the Lich said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty and casual cruelty. Such touching revelations, such moral complexity, such irrelevance. He gestured, and more screaming stones cracked open, but these released wraiths twisted by centuries of crystallized hatred. You see, I've had 3 years to prepare for this moment. 3 years to gather allies, set traps, and perfect my collection. The undead army that emerged from the sands numbered in the hundreds, skeletons and zombies and worse things that had never been alive to begin with. They moved with perfect coordination, each unit responding to Mordain's will as if they shared a single mind. You let me gather the fragments, Zephyr realized with growing certainty. You could have stopped me at any time. Of course, but why hunt scattered pieces when I could let you bring them all to one convenient location? Mordain's laugh was the sound of graveyard settling. Besides, I wanted you to understand exactly how helpless you are, how completely you've been outmaneuvered. There's just one problem with your plan, Cale said, raising his sword until it blazed with holy fire. You assumed I'd let you murder everyone in reach without offering some small objection. A paladin and a necromancer working together? Mordain seemed genuinely amused. How delightfully paradoxical. Also, how utterly futile. The battle that followed was less a fight than a natural disaster with delusions of tactics. Kale's holy magic carved through the undead ranks like sunlight through shadow, while Zephyr's necromancy turned the fallen remains into weapons against their former allies. The screaming stones provided both ammunition and cover as crystallized souls were released to join the fray. But they were outnumbered 10-1, and Mordain had centuries of experience in magical combat. His spells came in perfectly coordinated waves, bone spears erupting from beneath their feet, while acid clouds descended from above, forcing them to divide their attention between offense and survival. "We can't win this," Kale gasped as a skeletal warrior's blade opened a gash across his ribs. Holy fire cauterized the wound instantly, but the paladin was already showing signs of exhaustion. "Then we change the game," Zephyr replied, pulling one of the phylactery fragments from his chest. The crystal pulsed with stored power, not just Valdris's soul, but echoes of his knowledge. "My master was researching ways to achieve lichdom without losing one's humanity. What if the process worked in reverse?" He pressed the fragment against his chest and spoke words in the old tongue, syllables that predated human speech. Power flowed through him, not the cold touch of traditional necromancy, but something warmer, something that remembered what it felt like to be alive. The change was immediate and dramatic. Zephyr's magic shifted from manipulation of death to preservation of life, his spells now healing the wounded and strengthening the living rather than simply commanding the dead. The released spirits rallied around him, their anguish transforming into hope as they felt echoes of Valdris's compassion flowing through his apprentice. "Impossible," Mordain snarled, his perfect composure cracking for the first time. "That research was theoretical, unproven, dangerous beyond measure." "My master always said the most dangerous magic was the kind that made people better than they were," Zephyr replied, gesturing toward a group of screaming stones. They shattered simultaneously, releasing dozens of crystallized souls who immediately turned on their crystalline prison guards with centuries of accumulated fury. The tide of battle began to shift as more spirits joined their cause, but Mordain had one final gambit. He raised his staff, a rod of crystallized malice that pulsed with trapped screams, and spoke a single word that made reality flinch. The whispering wastes responded to his call, every grain of sand suddenly animated with murderous intent. The ground became quicksand that sought to drag down the living, while crystallized screams took physical form as cutting winds that could flay flesh from bone. "You want to save everyone," Mordain shouted over the supernatural storm. "Then save them from this." Zephyr looked at Kale, who nodded with the grim understanding of someone who'd accepted his fate. Together, the necromancer and paladin pressed their hands to the largest screaming stone in the wasteland, a monolith that contained not dozens, but hundreds of trapped souls. "For Valdris," Zephyr whispered. "For redemption," Kale added. They shattered the monolith together, holy fire and necromantic power combining in ways that should have been impossible. The explosion of released souls created a shockwave that rippled across the entire wasteland, shattering every screaming stone and freeing every trapped spirit in a cascade of liberation that turned the desert's anguished chorus into something resembling hope. But the effort cost them both. Zephyr collapsed as the phylactery fragments went dark, their stored power exhausted. Kale's armor cracked from the strain of channeling so much holy energy through his mortal frame. Mordain's army, suddenly deprived of their crystalline weapons and faced with hundreds of freed spirits seeking vengeance, began to crumble. The Lich himself retreated with the tactical wisdom of someone who'd survived centuries by knowing when to cut his losses. "This isn't over, apprentice," he called as his remaining forces covered his withdrawal. "I still have 4 fragments to your 3, and next time I won't underestimate your capacity for noble stupidity." As the dust settled over the no longer whispering wastes, Zephyr and Kale sat among the ruins of their victory, both too exhausted to celebrate their survival. "You could have let me die," the paladin observed quietly, would have made your quest simpler. My master taught me that some things matter more than simple. Zephyr studied the darkened fragments in his palm, still warm, but no longer pulsing with inner light. Besides, I'm beginning to think revenge isn't what Valdris would have wanted from me. Then what would he want? Zephyr looked out over the wasteland, where freed spirits were finally fading to whatever rest awaited them beyond death. Something better than what I've become. The nexus of souls stood at the crossroads between life and death, reality and dream, hope and despair. Here, where the barriers between worlds grew thin as gossamer, the most powerful necromantic rituals became possible, and the most dangerous mistakes became inevitable. Zephyr arrived at the ancient stone circle with 3 phylactery fragments and the growing certainty that he was about to make the worst decision of his life. The fragments no longer pulsed with inner light, their power drained from the battle in the whispering wastes, but they still hummed with the echo of Valdris's imprisoned soul. Not enough, Whisper observed from his perch atop a weathered pillar carved with symbols that predated human civilization. 7 fragments for a complete resurrection. 3 for, what? A partial return? A twisted echo? A vengeful ghost with delusions of mortality? Or something else entirely, Zephyr replied, beginning to trace ritual circles in the Nexus's reality-warped soil. Valdris was researching preservation of knowledge, not just preservation of life. What if I don't resurrect him at all? What if I preserve his wisdom instead? The raven cocked its head with interest that was either admiration or alarm. Dangerous thinking, apprentice. Knowledge without context becomes dogma. Wisdom without experience becomes fanaticism. Are you certain you want to unleash your master's research on a world that's already proven it will misuse such power? Before Zephyr could answer, the air above the Nexus began to shimmer with malevolent energy. Mordain descended from the impossible sky like judgment given form and terrible purpose, his transformation finally complete. The Lich who'd once been Valdris's student had achieved perfect undeath through the systematic murder of innocents, his body now a masterwork of preserved malice and crystallized hatred. 4 fragments, Mordain announced, displaying the phylactery pieces he'd claimed through 3 years of careful planning. Against your 3, mathematics was never your strong suit, was it, apprentice? Mathematics, Zephyr agreed, continuing his ritual preparations with steady hands. Tell me, did you calculate the cost of murdering everyone who might have carried forward our master's work? Did you factor in the price of turning knowledge into monopoly, wisdom into weapon? Mordain's laugh was the sound of tombstones cracking under their own weight. Sentiment, always your weakness, just as it was Valdris's. He could have been the greatest Lich in history, ruling through pure knowledge and accumulated power. Instead, he wasted his brilliance trying to preserve his humanity. Maybe humanity is worth preserving. Is it? The Lich gestured, and the Nexus responded to his will. Reality twisted into new configurations as the barriers between planes thinned to transparency. Look around you, apprentice. Look at what your precious humanity has accomplished. The visions came in waves. Wars fought over scraps of magical knowledge, apprentices murdering their masters for forbidden texts, entire schools of necromancy destroyed by those who feared what they couldn't understand. Humanity's relationship with death magic was written in blood and terror, a chronicle of power sought and wisdom ignored. We could change that, Mordain continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence of the perfectly convinced. Join with me willingly, and I'll show you how to use Valdris's research properly. We'll create a new order where death serves life, where knowledge flows freely to those strong enough to bear it. Under your absolute control. Under perfect guidance. Someone must shepherd the flock, apprentice. Someone must decide who deserves power and who requires protection from their own ignorance. Zephyr completed the first circle of his ritual and began the second, larger pattern that would encompass the entire Nexus. My master had a different idea. He thought people could learn wisdom through experience rather than having it imposed by force. Your master was a fool who died for his idealism. My master was a scholar who discovered something you'll never understand. Zephyr's magic began to resonate with the Nexus's accumulated power, drawing energy from the boundary between worlds. The difference between serving death and being served by it. The battle that followed transcended normal concepts of violence. Mordain wielded death as a weapon-bone spears that tore through dimensions, necrotic energy that aged matter into component atoms, spells that turned the very air into crystallized screams. His power was vast, refined by centuries of research and murder, focused through absolute certainty in his own righteousness. Zephyr fought differently. Where Mordain commanded death, Zephyr collaborated with it. Where the Lich imposed his will through force, the apprentice requested aid through understanding. His magic flowed like water around Mordain's brutal assaults, deflecting rather than blocking, preserving rather than destroying. But even collaboration had limits against overwhelming power. Mordain's spells came in perfectly coordinated waves that forced Zephyr back step by step, each retreat bringing him closer to the edge of the nexus, where reality dissolved into probability and hope, became mathematical uncertainty. You cannot win through kindness, apprentice. Mordain's staff carved through the air, leaving trails of crystallized malice that sang with trapped screams. Power respects only greater power. Your master's compassion died with him, accept that truth and embrace what you could become. A bone spear pierced Zephyr's shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending phylactery fragments scattering across the ritual circle. He landed hard against one of the nexus pillars, blood streaming from wounds that burned with necrotic fire. That's when Kael Doomright arrived. The paladin emerged from between dimensions like divine wrath given tactical purpose, his armor blazing with holy symbols that made reality stabilize in his presence. His sword carved through Mordain's next attack, holy fire meeting necrotic energy in an explosion that made the nexus pillars ring like cathedral bells. Thought you could use some backup, Kael said, taking position beside Zephyr with the easy confidence of someone who'd already chosen his side in an impossible conflict. Besides, I owe you for the Whispering Wastes. A paladin and a necromancer, Mordain observed with genuine amusement. Working together against the natural order, how perfectly symbolic of everything wrong with your master's philosophy. Maybe, Zephyr admitted, struggling to his feet and gathering the scattered fragments. But it's also something you'll never understand. Trust freely given rather than loyalty purchased through fear. Together, they pressed their assault with the desperate coordination of allies who trusted each other completely despite having every reason for suspicion. Kael's holy magic provided perfect counterpoint to Zephyr's necromancy, light and shadow dancing in harmony as they carved through Mordain's defenses. But the Lich had centuries of experience in magical combat, and his power was vast beyond mortal comprehension. Slowly, inevitably, he began to drive them back toward the Nexus's edge where reality frayed into chaos. Enough, Mordain raised his staff high, drawing power from every death that had ever occurred within 100 miles of the Nexus. I will show you the true meaning of necromantic mastery. The spell he unleashed was beyond anything Zephyr had ever witnessed, a working that turned death itself into a weapon, pulling life force from every living thing in the surrounding landscape, and channeling it into pure destructive potential. Trees withered, grass died, even the insects fell silent as Mordain's magic drained the world itself to fuel his victory. Zephyr felt his own life force being pulled toward that hungry vortex and made a choice that would have horrified his younger self. Instead of fighting the drain, he embraced it, not to feed Mordain's spell, but to become part of the magical working itself. "What are you doing?" Kael shouted, his own strength wavering as the Lich's magic found new targets. "Something my master would probably call suicidally stupid," Zephyr replied, pressing all 3 phylactery fragments against his chest and speaking words in the old tongue that made the Nexus pillars hum with resonant power. "I'm becoming the ritual instead of just performing it." The fragments blazed with light as Zephyr's life force flowed into them, not to resurrect Valdris, but to preserve everything the old Lich had represented. His knowledge, his compassion, his belief that power should serve rather than rule. The magic that resulted was unlike anything in the traditional necromantic arsenal. Instead of commanding death, it offered choice. The effect on Mordain's spell was immediate and catastrophic. His carefully constructed working, designed to drain life from unwilling victims, suddenly faced a target who was offering his essence freely. The magical circuit overloaded, power flowing backward through the connection to strike the Lich with his own redirected energy. Impossible, Mordain gasped as his own spell began consuming him from within. No one sacrifices power willingly. No one chooses weakness over strength. That's the difference between us, Zephyr said, his voice growing faint as more of his essence flowed into the fragments. You think compassion is weakness. My master knew it was the strongest magic of all. The phylactery fragments rose from Zephyr's hands, floating in the air above the nexus as they pulsed with harmonized light. But instead of Valdris's form materializing from the crystals, something else emerged, not the Lich himself, but the preserved essence of everything he'd believed and taught. Knowledge flowed from the fragments in streams of visible light, settling into the nexus pillars like seeds taking root in fertile ground. Valdris's research, his methods, his philosophy, all of it preserved not in the mind of a single resurrected Lich, but in a form that could be shared, studied, and built upon by future generations. And with that knowledge came Valdris's voice, speaking through the fragments one final time. My dear apprentice, the familiar tones carried warmth that made Zephyr's chest ache with recognition. You've learned the hardest lesson of all, that some things matter more than personal desires. You chose to preserve wisdom rather than indulge in vengeance. You chose to trust rather than control. You chose to let go. Mordain's form was already beginning to dissolve, as his own redirected magic consumed him from within. The Lich who'd sought to monopolize death magic faced the ultimate irony destruction by his own accumulated power, turned against him by an apprentice who'd learned to offer rather than take. This isn't possible, he whispered as his carefully preserved form crumbled into component shadows. Everything is possible when you stop trying to control it, Valdris's voice replied gently. That was always your problem, my former student. You sought to own death instead of learning to dance with it. As Mordain faded into nothingness, his phylactery fragments fell to the nexus floor, not destroyed, but cleansed of the hatred and fear that had animated them. They lay quiet and still, waiting for someone wise enough to use them properly. Kale knelt beside Zephyr, who had collapsed after channeling so much of his life force into the preservation ritual. The Necromancer was pale, weak, but alive, changed by the experience but not consumed by it. Is it over? The paladin asked quietly. This part is, Zephyr replied, looking up at the knowledge streams still flowing from the floating fragments into the nexus pillars. But the real work is just beginning. Someone needs to make sure this wisdom is used properly. Someone needs to teach the next generation that power serves best when it serves others. You have my blessing for that work, Valdris's voice said, already fading as the fragments settled back to earth. But remember, true teaching happens through example, not lecture. Show them what necromancy can be when guided by compassion rather than commanded by fear. The knowledge streams completed their flow, and the fragments went dark, not dead, but dormant, their purpose fulfilled. Around the nexus, the pillars now hummed with preserved wisdom, a library written in light and memory that would guide ethical necromancers for generations to come. 6 months later, Zephyr stood before his first class of students in a tower rebuilt from the ruins of Valdris's original stronghold. Senna Nightshade sat in the front row, her eager face reminding him painfully of his younger self. Beside her, other aspiring necromancers waited to learn the art of death magic, guided by respect for life. The first lesson, Zephyr began, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won wisdom, is that necromancy is not about controlling death. It's about understanding the relationship between ending and beginning, between what was and what could be. He gestured, and a withered flower on his desk bloomed into vibrant life, not resurrection, but preservation of the beauty that death couldn't touch. Power without compassion is just another form of violence. Knowledge without wisdom is just educated ignorance. Magic without respect for its consequences is just elaborate destruction. He looked each student in the eye, making sure they understood. We study death magic not to become more deadly, but to become more alive. Kale watched from the back of the classroom, his presence a reminder that even natural enemies could become allies when they shared common purpose. The paladin had taken on the role of ethics instructor, teaching the philosophical foundations that would keep the next generation of necromancers from following Mordain's path. After the students filed out, chattering excitedly about their first assignments, Whisper settled on Zephyr's shoulder with the comfortable weight of old companionship. "Strange how it all worked out," the Raven observed. "Valdris gets his legacy preserved, you get your master's approval, and the world gets necromancers who actually care about using their power responsibly. Everyone wins." "Almost everyone," Zephyr corrected, thinking of Mordain's final moments and the waste of potential that the Lich's choices represented. "But maybe that's the point. Redemption is always possible, but it has to be chosen. It can't be imposed." He looked out the tower window at the gardens, where his students were already practicing their newly learned techniques, preserving flowers, communicating with beneficial spirits, studying the boundary between life and death with reverence rather than ambition. "Valdris would be proud," he said quietly. "He already is," came the faintest whisper from the preserved knowledge stored in the tower's foundations. "And so am I, my dear apprentice, so am I." The phylactery fragments sat silent in their place of honor above the fireplace, their purpose fulfilled but their wisdom eternal. Around them, a new generation of necromancers learned to serve life by understanding death, guided by the preserved compassion of a master who'd chosen sacrifice over supremacy. In the end, that was the strongest magic of all, not the power to command, but the wisdom to let go. Outside, Whisper took flight toward the setting sun, carrying word of the new school to other aspiring necromancers across the realm. Death magic would continue, but it would be guided by different principles now. Preservation instead of domination, service instead of supremacy, love instead of fear. Valdris's true resurrection was complete, not as a Lich restored to unlife, but as ideals given new form through those who chose to carry them forward. The phylactery's last echo would resonate through generations, teaching each new necromancer that the greatest power lay not in conquering death, but in making peace with it. The apprentice had become the master, the cycle continued. And in the tower's foundations, crystallized wisdom pulsed gently with the rhythm of a heart that remembered what it meant to be human.